Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Well, this week on Summer School, we have Andrea Smith. Lauren, do you want to do a quick intro for Andy?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this is now week 4 of summer school. And if this is not your first episode, thank you for coming back. And if it is, welcome for the first time. This week we will be covering colonial violence and missing and murdered Indigenous women. This is kind of to coincide with some of the events and teach-ins that are going on with Save We Ob Project, which is my organizing entity. And so what we've been doing is like kind of putting in now all the things that we've been doing online in mass teaching on the ground in mass teaching. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about that, and we're very happy today to have Andrea Smith, who is an activist, academic, scholar, lawyer, all around amazing person. And we're so honored that she wants to be on our show today. So welcome, Andy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor. Okay.
If you have not read Conquest, we are going to strongly recommend that. Andy has written about sexual violence as a tool of conquest and a tool of genocide and colonization of Indigenous people and Indigenous women on the North American continent. And in addition to Conquest, she has many amazing talks and articles and all kinds of things with so much information about that and the history of kind of gender violence. So, Sui, what do you have to add to this?
Well, whenever Andrea is here, I kind of get a little tongue-tied because I'm too excited. But yeah, Andy also helped found the group Insight Women of Color Against Violence, which we frequently talk about in summer school. So Elisa last week really did a great job talking about state violence and how the state is the perpetrator. And so Andy is also part of the same group. And we're just hoping that we can kind of go through the history of MMIW, but then also really prompt people to reach out to me or Lauren and say that you want to host a teach-in in your local area. So me and Frank Bond will be holding one in Chicago if anyone wants to help with that. But that would be great so that we could kind of post all the dates and all the locations and really start kind of local movements.
Right, so yeah, we kind of started this off as something that was gonna just happen like across Montana. And as soon as we kind of like posted this and started talking about it within our other circles, there have been a lot of interest to do this in other places. So like so you just said Chicago, there's a couple different places in Oregon, of course in Montana, and I think Colorado happening also. So definitely. So let's kind of just get started around like what it is that we're talking about here. Andy, do you kind of want to start with this in terms of like a little bit of the history of like violence in your work and how this has been kind of coinciding with like other teach-ins about gender violence?
Well, I think the idea is that, at least in my experience, we tended to separate colonial violence from gender violence. Like when I remember in the early days of organizing, people would say, well, we can't worry about domestic violence now, we have to worry about survival issues, or we have to worry about sovereignty, as if the two were very different things. And what we weren't really looking at is how it was through gender violence that colonialism was successful in the first place, right? It was through gender violence that Native bodies were rendered inherently rapeable, and by extension, their lands inherently invadable and their resources inherently extractable. So that's why we always saw with, say, history of Native massacres, they were always accompanied by rape and sexual mutilation, because the goal wasn't just to kill Native peoples, but to kill our sense of even being a people. And so it no longer made sense to say, well, we'll worry about gender violence later, right? Like if you're saying, well, we can't worry about domestic violence because we have to worry about survival issues, but Native women are the women most likely to be killed by domestic violence, then when you're talking about survival, whose survival are you actually talking about? So it became clear that we had to address two simultaneously. But also, when we look at the mainstream anti-violence movement, we had to note the contradictions about how they claimed to be ending gender violence, but then weren't addressing state violence, which was one of the primary perpetrators of gender violence, particularly Native communities, right? So where have the feminist groups been on, say, supporting reparations for Native boarding school survivors, and boarding schools being the thing that largely brought sexual violence into Native communities, right? You don't see that feminist organizing around that. So this is kind of how we have to see these two as integrally related projects. What do you think, Lauren?
Great, thank you. I think that's a great intro to this. And what we've been doing at gender violence has been such, again, a big topic of interest in organizing, especially with the usage of social media. You know, and I see a lot of like this energy to want to do new things, both online and offline. So there is a new, like a new sense of wanting to move with this, right? Like that we're new strategies, and like, okay, there's awareness about the state being a problem now. There's awareness of like how the movement was co-opted, and you know, how do we get creative when like so much of this of what we know about anti-violence is either, you know, reporting and going to local victim service, and like not a lot outside of that. So as we talk more and more about like issues with, you know, misogyny, sexism, transmisogyny, these different types of violence is happening, like, hey, it's really also important to like learn the history about it again, understand like that the origins of this, understand the history, understand like how we didn't just like magically get here today. This is not a new problem. It's also not an individual problem. So I think it's really important to like keep coming back to like, okay, let's start, you know, at the beginning of like what sexual and physical, emotional violences were used in terms of like acquiring the USA.
Yeah, I agree. I found that the history isn't really just theoretical, like it makes a big difference in how people can hear things, right? Because when you talk about sexual violence in particular, I mean, it took a long time to really bring that issue to the forefront in Native communities. I mean, there was a lot of talk on domestic violence way before people were organizing around sexual violence, because there was a lot of, I think, individual shame attached to it, because that's actually, right, the goal of sexual violence. But when you start to frame the issue differently, to say the reason why it's here isn't because we're inherently dysfunctional, but it's the result of state policies like boarding schools, right, then it takes it out of the individual level and you see the larger historical context, and it's something you can kind of see and address, right? You can start to take the shame out of it because you see, wait, this isn't something we did, right? This is a part of state policy. So yeah, I find the history very important, and it's not a surprise, right, that a lot of Native communities that were organizing around this, the Department of Justice didn't want them to use the words colonization, right? They wanted to keep it at the individual level, precisely because when you start to make the connections, it also changes your solutions to the problem, right? They become less, oh, you just need therapy and lock them up, right? You have to look at the whole state complex that renders Native peoples generally rapeable.
Right. Absolutely. You know, that's been such a big part of this, and part of, you know, kind of now using this teach-in stuff, again, whether that it's online or offline, and doing like a teaching of history and the teaching of process as transformative justice, like as a strategy for that. So it's like, you know, let's help you like understand a little bit more how we got here, so then you can start thinking more about like, okay, I feel like I have a little bit better of a grasp on like why so many things might feel so out of control. So yeah, I'm really excited that as we continue to talk about this, there's a historical component that we're reconceptualizing this totally differently on a really large scale now. So that's definitely part of this. And then the other part about missing and murdered Indigenous women, we hear a lot about this in Canada, and there's lots of debates over like an inquiry and the RCMP and the government as a whole and the response to this, and and what's going on is really important and severe. And what we want to do too with this is broaden this issue also and say, it's definitely a cross-continent thing that's happening and a cross-continent phenomenon. And under this structure of the USA, they're doing a really significantly better job of like making this like not known, of like wiping this from our consciousness and wiping this from like our ability to address it. Even though we know things like Native women are experiencing, the highest murder rate in the country, and it's like our leading cause of death, and all of these things, but that's not necessarily connecting to like the bigger scope, the bigger picture.
So, Lauren, can you say a little bit what you think about, given this context, like how do we strategize to do things in the immediate, reflective of the larger context, right? So, like when we think of things like VAWA, the Tribal Law and Order Act, right, that these issues often get represented in a very binary fashion. Right, either you're a sellout because you're working with the state, or does it make sense, or whatever, you're totally impractical, can't do anything. Like, how do we strategically think about how to work within the context we're in to get to the point of decolonization?
Oh, that's a good question. I think a lot of this, again, is there's like so much lack of, I don't want to say lack of, there is not a lot of awareness around what is happening in terms of like the full process of this, right? Because it's like how we've described it, there's multiple layers of disappearance going on. There's multiple layers of death. There's multiple layers of the ability to like wipe this from our consciousness, even in our own, communities, which is what we're finding of even the history teaching and, educational component of this, is that there's kind of like, well, where do we even begin? Like now seeing that like disappearing from life, disappearing from media, disappearing in death reports when indigeneity is erased. Like it feels really out of control, right? It feels like I'm totally lost. I think it is like a lot, again, starting with like educating, supporting, starting to support when individuals or families come forward like, oh yeah, you know what, actually 10 years ago this person disappeared and nobody did anything about it, and you're right, this is happening, this is like right around us. I didn't really know this was around us. And I think even starting to like build relationships with other groups who are kind of doing this to strategize, I think is really important.
Yeah, I was just thinking how there's a lot of critiques of the Tribal Law and Order Act and VAWA, which I think are good. And I remember, being part of the strategic conversations from way back and, having major issues with it. But I just think it's interesting that we kind of lose the history of why people made these decisions. On one hand, does that make sense? So everybody just always sounds like they're stupid for doing something, like we don't know what they were trying to figure out. And then on the other hand, we often get very wedded to the strategy. Like we thought it was a good idea, and so we're going to hold on to it, even if we find out we made a mistake. So I'm just wondering if this could be a place for a different way of thinking about organizing. Like, again, like with Tribal Law and Order Act, I mean, that came out of actually a lot of people criticized it for being very law and order. But I think what gets missed is that organizing came out of people who were actually critical of that, right? And they saw this as a way to begin to repeal Oliphant, right, to get colonial control off of Indigenous governance. knowing that, and this was something we could never have imagined even a few years prior. Like it seemed like hopeless that Oliphant could even be addressed at all. But this seems strategic. Did it not come with other negative things? Of course, but people are thinking, wow, this is something we couldn't imagine we might be able to roll back on Oliphant. Now, it could be the case that later we'll say that was a mistake, and I think that's okay to say. Does that make sense? I think we should always be critically interrogating our decisions, but I'm just noticing that we don't give complexity to these moments that we're in and why we're making these decisions that could then inform us how we might make future decisions.
Totally. I think tribal law and order and VAWA, the tribal provisions in VAWA, not it in its entirety, are really important when it comes to all of this. Right now, currently, my tribe is redoing the codes and finally letting go of like really antiquated colonial white Western laws that were put on to say this is how you're going to address sexual violence and domestic violence, and we're deciding that, and they're redoing it so it's like what's best for us and what's best for like minimizing mass incarceration. Like these people thought of these things when doing this. That was part of this. And same thing, a big part of what one of my partners, Laura, who we do the map, I do the map and database with, she's in Canada, and she was also like helping figure out what are some of the issues with like missing and murdered Indigenous women USA side. And we discovered like through tribal law and order that there was a component in there about tracking and ability to track, because prior to that, and I'm still not even sure fully now, you don't have the ability. I mean, the government had decided, no, that is our control, that is our decision, like we have jurisdiction over that, even things with tracking. I mean, so there are so many things that have contributed to, as you've, laid out very beautifully in Maze of Injustice, that have made this such an overall problem, even like little things here and there that have all kind of come together with colonial violence and colonial control to create such an overwhelming, bigger issue. So yes, I thank you for bringing those up.
So what do you think now in the post, given this, what do you think is our next steps, strategically speaking, right, that we can remain critical of that legislation, right, how it is still connected to the carceral state, and yet moving forward in terms of thinking of how to divest from that, right, like given the windows kind of created from that legislation to divest from it, is the teach-ins then kind of the next step in that direction?
I think, I feel like we're at a time when a lot of people are now confronting a lot, confronting of like intergenerational trauma and current instances of violence, and that it's like kind of coming at this space right now, especially because, even our parents, our grandparents, who are still very much alive now, I mean, they are all survivors of boarding schools, and confronting that and being able to support them in that, and then also talk about what's happening now. So I think we are at a really hot time of like, let's do these things and collectively and as the best we can to be able to like see the bigger pictures, and we might then be able to come up with something, totally that we've never thought of before. And that might include more steps to continue to overturn Oliphant or do a full Oliphant fix, which I'm definitely here to support that.
Right. Yeah. And also Public Law 280, right, in its problem. So
I think, with this, and to tie in, and I know, Andy, you wanted to mention this going on with the IVAWA and the International Violence Against Women Act. I think there's a lot of parallels to like what happened and what has happened with Indigenous people, Indigenous women here. You know, with the United States as a force, you know, not only causing the violence, but then deciding to like do their own version of the Major Crimes Act overseas and say, we're going to decide and we have control over this now. You know, and we're going to set up the carceral state over there. And this is really to protect our interests. Surprise, same that it's the United States needing land and whatever resources those are that are causing the violence over there, to make sure that there's control of that. And I think that exactly is what's happening with this Ivawa stuff, which I'm really, makes me really nervous, makes me very concerned, and I think it's a horrible idea. And we've kind of touched on that, but Andy, do you want to add some things?
Yeah, I think, well, one, a lot of things to say about it. Well, one, I think that when you read it, you see really the same impulse you saw around colonization of indigenous peoples. Or like one of the main rationales given for colonizing Native peoples was that they were backwards in terms of gender politics. They needed to be liberated, even though, of course, the opposite was the case. Right? So I think this has been since time immemorial, like here in these lands, the rationale for colonization is that the settler society is somehow more evolved when it comes to gender relations. So this is just a continuing rationale. And if you look at the war in Iraq, right, that was George Bush and Laura Bush specifically stated, right, we're doing this in order to liberate women. And then you had groups like the Fund for Feminist Majority specifically backing the war in Afghanistan, saying, you know, this is going to liberate women from the Taliban because, of course, if you bomb women, that liberates them. So I just don't see this. I see this as pretty continuous with the colonial rationale that we should be skeptical of. But also, and I think this just goes to show, I think, again, back to our previous conversation, how we need to be more strategic when we're engaging legislation and not take it wholesale. Right, like when the VAWA was first passed, I mean, it has done some good things, right? It has provided a lot of funding and made the issue a lot more visible, something we can organize around. I don't think we can dismiss that, but it was attached to a very repressive anti-crime bill that has actually led to the incarceration of domestic violence survivors, right? So I think if at that point we could have more complex or related to that legislation in a more complex way, you know, to say we support this provisions, we think this other stuff is really repressive, we don't support that regime. But instead, we just had to say we love VAWA, period, unconditionally. So it's not hard then just to call it IVAWA and everybody just has, oh, that's that feminist thing we all like. Right, and so I just think if we're going to do these short-term things, we have to be more strategic and not put ourselves in the position just because there's some kind of quote-unquote feminist provision on a bill that the bill itself is entirely good. Because then it's just easily to get co-opted. Now we can have VAWA. Next thing we'll have space VAWA. I mean, just VAWA just becomes kind of this unconditionally good thing you can't question now.
Right, right. And, you know, with that, you know, recently, which has also been very concerning and scary to me, is to see how many, you know, groups like that are basically the PR arms of the DOJ and other, you know, the Department of Defense, using language in their programs, awareness, you know, whatever they're trying to push about, you know, movement building and revolution and, you know, that this is a movement we're having, and I think that is not a coincidence. I think there is very much a watching of what is happening in our discussions of gender violence, and both domestically and abroad. And really taking that, because that's what people are feeling, and there's lots of energy, and so you know, the taking of that to be like, oh, look, yep, us too. So part of the movement, passing these things, still, you know, having like attachment to the state and state control, and I think that like in part of interrogating, you know, these legislations, like we have to interrogate like what are these groups saying and like the language they're using and who's that really coming from, like, you know, like looking at this also, like the bigger picture of that.
Yeah, I mean, and that happened, of course, here, and I think it's still being actively exported. It's not just like the Department of Defense or Department of Justice, but also the nonprofit industrial complex. I've been to a lot of these global meetings on gender violence, and it's shocking to me how these major foundations are really exporting the certain models by some of the more mainstream anti-violence groups as the models to be global, right? Like a very therapeuticized model, a very individualized, and not addressing the links between gender violence and state violence, but also supplanting a lot of the great organizing that's happening in different contexts. Like I remember one time I met this amazing grassroots organization that was doing healthcare, they were doing microcredit, and they were also addressing domestic violence because they had so successfully become seen as kind of a needed critical group for that community that when they addressed domestic violence, they would actually get listened to, right? And it's a very different model here where you have this group provides this service, this group provides this service, this group provides this service, like it's kind of a niche approach. But in that same context, right, you know, these major foundations had come in and said, no, you must support this U.S., I won't name any names, famous anti-violence model approach instead, right? So I just think IVALA is part of this larger kind of colonial exportation of a certain way of addressing gender violence that keeps things safe for the state.
Right, right. And also, like, you know, and back to all the things we're talking about under this idea that because the U.S. has all these things under control, and of course we're the model of, you know, how to be the problem solvers of this. You know, and meanwhile, you know, back to like even Indigenous women having these high rates of like death and murder that in other countries we would label femicide.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so like rethinking about like what is happening here with all of this has been really important. I think needs to continue to happen, continue this way, continue awareness of this, and you know, and much like here. With this decolonizing the anti-violence movement, I mean that is also happening abroad. There are plenty of groups in all over the world naming the state, colonialism, apartheid, genocide, you know, systemic problems, historic problems as why rates of gender violence are so bad. So that is happening too, and I think that deserves that attention as well.
I was thinking, Lauren, this kind of reminds me of the work you're doing on rape on campuses, and also seeing the historical context for that, because it seems like, again, one of the colonial impulses was not just to destroy Indigenous peoples, but to destroy an alternative for people in European societies as well, right? Like, it was not practical. It couldn't happen to have Indigenous communities that were more egalitarian live side by side with the colonial society that's very hierarchical, because people won't want to live there anymore, right? So in order to kind of keep patriarchy in place, it has to seem normal and inevitable. So I'm thinking too, like, how is this similar to, for instance, just the epidemic rates of rape on campuses that we've so normalized, right? That we're all ready to save somebody somewhere else, and yet we tolerate, like, we don't even think it's abnormal that 1 in 4 women will be raped on campus, and then if we include rapes of people who are transgendered, then the rates of gender, violence are just epidemic. And I remember one of my professors, not my professor, my nephew's professor, but Fred Moten was saying, why are we still even teaching on campuses, right? This should be so awful that we are stopping business as usual, and yet we don't really even blink an eye. So have you seen any connections between what you've been studying about kind of this epidemic rates of gender violence on campuses with kind of the exportation of saving people somewhere else in IVALA?
Sure. Yeah, and thank you for bringing this up, because this is definitely a deep concern in this area of like all-encompassing gender violence things, and just looking at like it is very high on campuses. That there is something going on, in the confines of like where people are supposed to be, you know, getting this wonderful education to be able to go out in the world and be an adult and solve the problems. And the amount of violence is incredible. And, you know, not only if you factor in, you know, transgender violence, if you factor in like just violence overall, like even what has been, you know, like male rape, which I think it's like formally categorized, even higher. I mean, just, and part of this also, like, this process of erasing it from your consciousness is that, well, like, even if there are reports taken, oftentimes they'll be erased, they'll be labeled as something else, they'll be labeled as harassment or hazing. Murders on campus, very often labeled as other things, like accidents or, you know, same thing, hazing, something. So, like, we don't even have the full scope, like, technically in a formal report of what's happening. And such the symptom of, like, you know, these being, like, very white, male-dominated institutions, capitalist now, very more so than ever, you know, corporate entities. And that this is a crisis, and I really appreciate Fred saying that, like, how are these still operating when this is the amount of violence and, like, extreme things going on? But
I think some other countries need to come in and save us, right?
Yeah,
like, that's,
can someone intervene here?
Yes.
And, you know, and then practicing new modes of, like, organizing even on campuses too has been really important. The more and more that, like, there's attempt to, like, criminalize campuses more and empower more police, and just, like, this really odd continuing to, like, harp on drinking culture. So what's happening is, like, very still trying to export this, like, carceral stuff, but then also really just, like, ignoring and minimizing the problem. I mean, I know there's kind of now a response of, like, campus violence is bad, you know, but I don't think that there is, like, that urgency. There's still something about what's happening that's like, well, it's not that bad. Well, that's not really happening here. The real problems, the real violence is, you know, somewhere over there.
Well, and even when they address it, it's always done. The problem is being your surrounding neighborhood, which is often racialized. At least at UC Riverside, right? We always get these crime alerts about the perpetrators who are always presumed to not be residing on the campus. And so I remember, just in classes, people would say, "Oh, I just feel so afraid that you need to make the campus safer. I don't feel safe on the streets." And I said, "But you're most likely to be raped in your dorm room, right?" And it just didn't even compute. It's like, that's where you're really in danger. But I think that's so, to the extent that a solution's proposed, it's always, again, externalizing the threat, even when campuses address it.
Yeah, you know, I talked to Sui about this over the course of the past few months, and this externalizing, and also not only, like, happening off campus and, like, out there in the neighborhood, but this whole thing about even sexual assault alerts, and that what's only an alert is when it's a stranger attack. Like, there could be 20 reports to either victim services or the campus police, and the one that will get an attention and email out let's look at the problem, let's, you know, bring awareness to this, is, like, the one out of a million stranger attacks that happen. And, like, that's very intentional.
Yep. So again, I think these are all about the colonial legacies, right? Of again, it's about normalizing either the campus or the settler state, right, as the safe zone, right, that's actually built on gender violence in the cases of campuses, and built on colonial violence against Indigenous peoples, Black peoples, other people who've been racialized. But the threat is always somewhere else that we need to kind of be worried about. Right? I remember I was at one thing. It was actually my other hat, there was this, I was talking to somebody who was with the Institute of Religion and Democracy, and they were talking about the debate amongst white evangelicals about gender issues, right? And some that are more conservative saying, oh, there's no problem with gender oppression in the U.S., and other people said, yes, there's a problem. But the person said, but we found a way how we could organize together. We couldn't agree whether or not there's gender oppression in the U.S., but we all agree third world women are oppressed, so we'll just go work together and save them. So anyway, it's kind of the same kind of what is the phrase, saving brown women from brown men becomes a way to kind of consolidate kind of this white supremacist sisterhood here that actually doesn't even do, you know what I mean, in the end, of course, is colonial and racist, but also in the end actually serves to consolidate gender violence even within white societies.
Right, right. And I think, again, even, you know, with campus stuff and just overall, like, looking at the histories and understanding, like, how we got here, you know, I read lists and different things. I read a lot all the time, especially with, like, researching different things. And
we're very happy about that.
You know what I just read today is often like how I start the morning. You know, in these lists about like status of women across the world, where the highest rates of like violence are, you know, just different forms of discrimination. The U.S. is always up there in the worst. I mean, it's, you know, consistently in a number of areas, whether that's, you know, like I said, intimate partner violence, birth, job pay, people in government. I mean, name something. And, you know, that is also not being confronted, like, you know, within all of these things, that the United States is a very violent place. It's a very violent place towards women, especially women of color, especially transgender women, gender nonconforming, just women identified people. And that's another thing that we kind of have like extracted from our consciousness, that like, oh, the West, it's this wonderful place and all these, you know, things, because there's all this money and wealth, and so you know, this is a great place that doesn't have all these problems. God, this is one of the world's most violent places in the world.
Right, and then the irony, like, where do you see often the most gender violence is in the military, but yeah, we're going to make military in charge of solving gender violence through IVAWA, right?
Yeah, that's another one. The United States military is like probably the most violent institution, I think, that we have, even in the confines of the country, and just between like the military members, between now private contractors and all these private defense, which, you know, God knows how much there are now. People in clandestine missions, you know, just the scope of it, very violent, causing so much violence here and in these places abroad that we're bringing democracy. I mean, ridiculous.
So what are some of since you're doing the teach-ins, what are some of the strategies you've been using? What have you learned from these processes about how to kind of make connections for people? And kind of thinking different ways to address colonial gender violence.
So kind of the process of this is starting out, like I said, with the base of history. Like, you know, let's talk about how we got here today. Let's talk about, you know, invasion of the United States. Okay, let's talk about these violences used to acquire what we have now. And then they're getting into, like, boarding schools, getting into, like, what was the other part of this? Boarding schools and just, you know, state policy in terms of violence. And so we have that as kind of like the base. And then we get into, like, okay, what are you know, the specifics of violence to be able to understand it, kind of like all the things that happen with abuser dynamics. Like, let's break this down. Like, what does violence look like? Because part of this, like, externalizing it and, like, making it that happens only from strangers out there somewhere in the world or somewhere off campus or somewhere out there in the dark, is that continuing to perpetuate that continues to perpetuate, like, a place of, like, not understanding, like, what it's going to look like, how this happens, how this forms, like, in all these different ways. So it's really important to understand that also, to understand, like, the different facets of physical, sexual, emotional, financial, mental abuses. And then also, like, centering this, and again, you know, and making it full circle, is like the carceral state is also a, you know, a perpetrator of this. So, like, if you can center that, like, in the midst of, like, kind of this other circle of, like, all these different things of history and, like, what is violence and, like, you know, just these general other parts of education, that always in the middle is that you've got to remember the state is also going to be violent. That is, like, allowing so much thinking of, like, right, I'm just going to automatically, you know, name what is a core problem here. That's going to allow me to start thinking about, okay, like, we can do some other things. For example, this week we started with, you know, the case of Hannah Harris, which was a young woman in Lame Deer, Montana. That's the Northern Cheyenne Territory. She disappeared last summer, and she ended up being found a few days later that she was killed. And it was very awful and very sad. And what happened in the process of that was her family and friends getting together and organizing their own search, their own reward fund, their own just awareness campaign. And now we've, you know, been partnering with what they named 21 Feathers to continue to do this. And they said, and they have identified themselves, that the police and the nonprofit and the groups that are supposed to be there, if this coincides with the state, are not going to be there. So we're going to actually not stop organizing just because what has happened with our loved one is done. Like, we're going to still remain this, like, support group, organized function to do all kinds of things for other families in the future when this happens again. And I think so, like, more things like this are, like, can happen and are happening. And kind of what we've been encouraging, you know, throughout all of this, when people have questions about, like, okay, where can I start and what can I do? And, like, kind of creating your own functioning group to be there, whatever that's going to mean. You know, is that going to mean you're going to have to, like, organize another community search at some point? Maybe. Does that mean you're going to have to, you know, be there to support another family emotionally because you didn't have that? Maybe. Is it going to be just a general place to, like, do more educating within the functioning of, like, what you have? Maybe that too. So I think that we can do more of that. We can do more independent groups, like, no matter how big or small, like, but to move in this same way.
Yeah, like I was saying, the families, Sisters in Spirit, right? An example of a group where after the Canadian government defunded that project, they just said, hey, we're going to keep organizing, and not even organize through the nonprofit industrial complex. So it's, and also like, well, I think it's kind of exciting that it feels like it's easier to organize explicitly more around gender violence. When I was first started, it was actually kind of difficult. Like, you couldn't really do that. So, like, I had to do this through blood pressure testing. So I learned how to take people's blood pressure tests and go to all the health fairs and kind of integrated it. And also, but also other groups that do it, like I was thinking of Out of Your Backpack Media, that have actually done a lot of really great work around transformative justice. But they do it through kind of their media work. So it just goes to show, because if you're going to have a holistic approach, right, there's many different kind of creative ways that you can kind of integrate this and show how it is connected to issues, and that you don't have to be, I mean, you don't have to have the big dollars to do that work, right? You can kind of do this on a grassroots level and change people's minds, you know.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the goals, and, like, kind of already what we're seeing with, like, the teach-in process. It's like, we've done all this work and, like, all this research, and, like, you know, and as people like who now understand this, we just want to give it to you so then you can like decide more. And like, because I know that a lot of people have like been wanting more education around this. I mean, in fact, that's kind of like always the number one thing identified as like, what do we need when talking about sexual and intimate partner violence? Like, what are we missing? And there's so much of like, well, we need to teach people not to do these things. We need to teach people what this is. We need to like educate to stop. And I'm a huge fan of that. So I think like, you know, once you do start having this, and probably I, you know, understand like a lot of this is really hard and uncomfortable, but once you can get in a place that's a little bit of support and more comfortable to just start letting this out, a lot of this just starts rolling. You know, a lot of this just people start almost instantly like, hey, you know what? Yeah, I have some ideas about this, and I have some feelings, and I've had some thoughts, and like, great, let's do that together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Suey.
I agree.
Oh. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, just say there's so many great projects, like this Native Youth Sexual Health Network. There's I mean, even just groups that don't have formal names to it. You know, like there's a lot of great work happening in Oklahoma. Just churches. You know, there's so many, I think, exciting Native organizing models that people that are not attached to nonprofits, so don't get recognized, and yet I think are really kind of changing the way that we look at this issue. So I think it's great. You know, there's obviously a lot of challenges that remain because, you know, there's still such a thing as settler colonialism that exists, but I think on the other hand, I think, and also I was thinking of Jennifer Dennett-Dale's work, you know, with the Navajo Human Rights Commission on this. So it just seems, on the other hand, people are kind of really taking this up and are kind of thinking outside the box. They're not saying, like, we don't have to do just what we've been told to do in our 40-hour DV training manual, but we kind of think creatively about what would actually end gender violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And Suey, I kind of wanted to check in with you about like stuff in terms of like organizing 101 stuff too, because I know like you've had so much work in this and have so much knowledge, and maybe not necessarily knowledge about, you know, like male gender violence and the things we're talking about, but just overall, like what do you think in terms of like organizing around these things?
Well, Lauren, anything I would say I would learn from you or Andy, so I'm not sure if I have anything new to add. But I guess most of my organizing experiences is on college campuses, and so I think what I've been seeing in the last year is that students are really kind of pulling away from only having registered student organizations and really starting to create grassroots movements in which they're creating more local partnerships with people that actually live in the communities in which the universities reside. And I think that's a more complete picture of kind of what community is and also how to find solutions for communities rather than, you know, looking within the institution for answers. But that's the only thing that I would add. I think you kind of covered it all. I do have a few questions that I've gathered that people have been asking, though. So if you have time, I can ask those, but I know that Andy's in a hurry, so I'll only ask them if you have time.
Okay, go for it.
Wait, Andy, is that good with you? Because I know you were like super busy.
I mean, I have to leave in 4 minutes, so I can...
Oh my God, lightning round.
Okay.
I just want to let everyone know who has asked a question that I'm not playing favorites. I'm just asking the shorter questions. So Andrea mentioned the Tribal Law and Order Act. What are some of the initial reactions or outcomes that you've heard of?
Well, I mean, I think the kind of the thinking behind it was actually basically what Laura's already mentioned, right? Was to then say now we can actually think of our own ways and solutions, right? If we can start to say now we can assert jurisdiction, we can also think creatively of how we want to do it. And I think Sarah Deer has written a lot of important work about this to say, you know, we tended to assume that jurisdiction meant more incarceration, but why? You know, I mean, why not explore ways that might be more effective as an exercise of sovereignty? So I see that people are saying, hey, no, I'm not saying everywhere, right? Some people are very invested in the carceral system, but other people are saying, well, let's think of some other ways that we might address gender violence that actually work, rather than being invested in the prison industrial complex.
Great. And
Lauren, what
actually,
do you think?
oh, yeah, Lauren.
Oh, yeah, I would just say that what Tribal Law and Order Act has allowed has been more like for individual independent communities to like decide what works for them best more than anything, and like allowed to think, like we don't have to do this like prison thing, jail thing. We can get excited as we also learn more of our histories, like to do other stuff. So for me, that's the biggest win.
Okay, another question that we have. Wait, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So Andrea mentioned again the prison system. How do the military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex uphold each other?
Lauren?
Oh, do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Well, I think like more than ever, they are definitely like functioning together, especially that are ways to address everything, every problem in the world is like invade, occupy, incarcerate, use use forces of violence. You can see that in the way the state operates, especially the more militarized they've become in the United States. The state operates, especially with communities of color. You see that abroad, again, with these invasions of occupations and like trying to export the carceral state there. It's like more ties than ever, I think, than to address with military and then criminalization is what I'm my observations.
Well, and also I think we see more and more of a cooperation between kind of military justice and legal law enforcement, particularly after the war on terror, right? Where there's a much more it used to be you're supposed to kind of sharply divide these processes, but now they're becoming so imbricated, right? So that the kind of state intelligence has immediate access to domestic law enforcement, so that they're almost becoming kind of one arm. But I think this just speaks to, in a certain way, the problem with saying state violence is that the state is violence, right? It's almost a redundant term. Like a nation state is itself an entity structured by violence, right? That's the presupposition of a state, right? That it should be that you should govern based on the logics of violence, domination, and control, right? So this is why I think decolonization is not just asking for a nicer, kinder state, but questioning why do we think states are the way to govern, given that that's the logics by which they do govern, and are there other models, particularly indigenous forms of governance, that are based on different principles such as mutuality, responsibility, care for land, etc.
Well, and I think too, like the more of these blending of the two is that there's the lines have been blurred between these two things. The more and more they've become private industries, both of them.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about like private military contractors, defense contractors kind of taking over of what military functions are. The same thing with the prison system and how that is a private industry. They're businesses. So that's kind of like their ultimate goals also. Like, what is money making with the use of like violence against our bodies?
So I'm going to have to sign off now. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Andy. You're just like the smartest person ever.
No, not at all. Okay.
It's a good thing I didn't have to do your
Great to
intro.
converse
Me
with
and
you.
Andy.
Okay.
Ever.
Okay, Andy.
It's great to hang out with you. Okay.
Bye, Andy.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Yay! Well, thanks for tuning in with me and Lauren. Lauren, do you want to kind of let people know how to get in touch with you if they'd like to host a local teach-in?
Sure. You can tweet at me. You can send an email to save.weob.project@gmail.com. And I'll, be around to answer questions and all of that.
Yay, and we'll definitely tweet out Lauren's email so that you can get in touch. And she has created this super, super helpful PDF that has all of the information available just in case, you want to look over it or print it out and make copies. So yeah. Lauren, we have one more question for you.
Okay.
Are you in a closet?
I'm in a storage room.
Oh my God! Everyone finally has an answer. I didn't want to mention the decor, but let me just tell you that HuffPost Life is nothing on your aesthetic.
We don't have anything on the storage closet. No.
I really like it though, because you're kind of like, you know what? It starts right here in the storage closet.
Starts in the storage closet. That's right.
Totally. Okay, well, before I babble on forever, I should probably take us off of our live broadcast. But thanks everyone that watched us. So we have a great Twitter conversation that Lauren will probably be able to look at now that she's done with the chat. So we can definitely continue the conversation there. Any last words, Lauren?
That's about it. Thank you so much for joining in this week as well as every other week. We so appreciate being able to engage with you about these different topics, especially with gender violence organizing, and let's keep going. Let's keep doing it. Thank you. Have a great Sunday. Thanks, Zoe.
Bye, everyone.